All right, so today we're going to take a deep dive into some, well, let's just say interesting perspectives on the whole Russia-Ukraine situation.
Interesting is certainly one word for it.
We've got a collection of interviews and commentary from Colonel Douglas MacGregor. And let me tell you, this guy does not mince words.
That's putting it mildly.
But before we really get into the weeds here, I think we need to address the elephant in the room.
And what elephant would that be?
MacGregor's, shall we say, reputation.
Ah, yes, his
That
reputation.
guy's been called a lot of things.
Huh.
Pro-Russia, Putin apologist, even a straight-up propagandist.
Which, let's be honest, isn't entirely off the mark if you look at some of his statements.
Exactly. So how do we, as critical thinkers, approach his perspective? How do we separate the signal from the noise, so to speak?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Because on the one hand, he's got this military background, years of experience, which you'd think would lend some weight to his analysis. But on the other hand, he's clearly pushing a very specific narrative, one that often aligns a little too neatly with the Kremlin's talking points.
So are we basically dealing with a wolf in sheep's clothing?
Hmm.
A guy using his credentials to give legitimacy to some questionable views?
It's possible. But let's not jump to conclusions just yet.
Fair enough. So let's dive into some of his main arguments. One of the first things that jumped out at me was this claim that the war is essentially over. Done deal, Russia won.
Yeah, that's a bit of a head-scratcher, isn't it? I mean, last I checked, the fighting is still going on.
Right, and not just skirmishes either. We're talking full-on offenses and counteroffensive.
Exactly. So when McGregor makes these declarative statements like Russia has already won,
Yeah.
it makes you wonder, what is he basing that on? What information is he privy to that the rest of the world is missing? Or is he perhaps deliberately misrepresenting the situation to fit a certain narrative?
And that's the thing, right? That's what makes this whole deep dive so fascinating and, frankly, a bit unnerving. Because if we're going to buy into McGregor's analysis, we have to accept that everyone else, intelligence agencies, military analysts, journalists on the ground, they're all wrong.
And that's a tough pill to swallow because it requires a massive leap of faith, a willingness to believe that there's this grand conspiracy to deceive the public.
Which, let's be honest, isn't entirely outside the realm of possibility these days.
True, but it's a dangerous path to go down because it can lead to a sort of epistemic nihilism where you start to doubt everything and everyone.
So where does that leave us? How do we approach the rest of this deep dive without falling down that rabbit hole of distrust and conspiracy?
Carefully, and with a healthy dose of skepticism.
So let's talk about this ISR strike complex thing that McGregor keeps bringing up. What is that exactly? Is it some kind of super weapon that Russia has up its sleeve?
Well, it's not exactly a secret weapon. I mean, the concept of an ISR strike complex has been around for a while. It basically refers to the integration of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities, ISR, right?
Right.
With the ability to rapidly analyze that information and launch precision strikes.
So basically, it's like having eyes and ears everywhere and then being able to act on that information very quickly and decisively.
Exactly. And it's not that the West doesn't have these capabilities. It's more that McGregor seems to be arguing that Russia has mastered this approach to warfare in a way that we haven't.
And that this is why we're seeing these huge casualty figures on the Ukrainian side.
Right. He's basically saying that Russia is fighting a smarter, more efficient war, while the West is stuck in this 20th century mindset of attrition warfare.
But that doesn't really jive with what we're seeing on the ground, does it? I mean, from what I understand, Russia has also suffered heavy losses.
Yeah, and this is where McGregor's analysis starts to get a little, shall we say, selective, because he tends to downplay or completely ignore any information that contradicts his narrative, like the fact that Russia has had to rely on outdated equipment, the logistical problems they've faced, the surprisingly stiff resistance they've encountered from the Ukrainians. He sort of glosses over all of that.
So it's almost like he's cherry-picking data to support a predetermined conclusion.
It's hard to avoid that impression sometimes, and
Yeah.
this is where that whole propaganda angle comes back into play.
Because if he's presenting a skewed version of reality.
Exactly. He's creating this echo chamber where his audience is only getting one side of the story, and it's a story designed to reinforce a very specific worldview.
And what is that worldview exactly? If we had to sort of sum it up, what's the overarching message that McGregor is trying to convey?
Well, in a nutshell, I'd say it's that the West is in decline, that our institutions are corrupt and incompetent, and that we're being led by a bunch of, well, I won't repeat the language he uses, but let's just say he's not a fan of the current leadership.
Right. And that Russia is this rising power that's going to reshape the global order, whether we like it or not.
Exactly. And he seems to think that this is not only inevitable, but also, in some ways, desirable.
So basically, we're supposed to just roll over and accept our fate as a fading superpower.
Well, he wouldn't put it quite like that, but there's definitely a sense in which he seems to be preparing his audience for a future in which the West is no longer calling the shots.
And in his view, Russia is going to be the one setting the agenda.
Along with China, of course. He talks a lot about this emerging Russia-China axis that's going to challenge Western hegemony.
And he sees this as a positive development.
Again, he's very careful about how he frames it. He talks about the need for a more multipolar world, one where power is distributed more evenly.
Sounds good in theory.
Right, but it's hard not to get the impression that his vision of multipolarity looks suspiciously like a world in which Russia and China get to dictate the terms.
And the U.S. just takes a backseat.
Pretty much.
And he doesn't see any problem with that.
Well, he would argue that it's not a matter of problem or no problem. It's simply the reality we're facing.
Okay, so we've got this ISR strike complex that's supposedly giving Russia this insurmountable advantage on the battlefield. We've got a West that's weak, divided, and led by fools. And we've got this inevitable rise of a new world order dominated by Russia and China.
You're catching on.
But all feels, I don't know, a little too convenient.
How so?
Like it's a story that's been crafted, almost too neat, too perfectly aligned with a certain agenda.
And what agenda would that be?
Well, let's just say it rhymes with Smellin's propaganda.
Ah, I see where you're going with this.
And I'm not saying that MacGregor is some kind of paid agent or anything like that.
Of course not.
But it's hard to ignore the fact that his analysis often aligns, shall we say, rather closely with the Kremlin's talking points.
It's definitely something to keep in mind as we delve deeper into his claims.
So where does this all leave us? I mean, we just spent the last hour or so wading through this very, let's say, particular view of the world.
Right, with a healthy dose of the West is doomed, sprinkled in for good measure.
Exactly. It's a lot to process.
Yeah. It can feel overwhelming, especially when you start to factor in all the other voices, all the other narratives out there.
And that's the thing, isn't it? Like, how do we even begin to make sense of complex situations like this when you've got these diametrically opposed viewpoints being presented with such certainty?
Well, that's where critical thinking comes in, and media literacy. It's more important now than ever to be able to, look beyond the surface, to question assumptions, to consider the source of the information.
Right. Because it's easy to get swept up in a compelling narrative, especially when it's being presented by someone with MacGregor's credentials,
Exactly. And that's why we have to be so careful about these, well, frankly, these bad faith actors who are out there pushing these simplistic, often self-serving narratives.
Okay. So let's bring this back to MacGregor. If we're listening to his analysis and we're trying to do so with a critical ear, what are some of the red flags we should be on the lookout for?
Well, for me, one of the biggest red flags is this tendency to dismiss any information that contradicts his narrative as Western propaganda.
Oh, absolutely. He does that a lot.
Right. Because it's this incredibly effective way to shut down critical thinking. Because if you start from the premise that anything that challenges your worldview is inherently biased or suspect, then you're essentially creating this echo chamber where your own beliefs are never challenged.
And that's how you end up with these really distorted views of reality.
Exactly. Another red flag to watch out for is the use of emotional language, fear-mongering, those sorts of rhetorical tactics that are designed to trigger an emotional response rather than engage in thoughtful discussion.
Right. Because when you're dealing with these complex issues, war, geopolitics, things like that, it's easy to let your emotions get the better of you.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what these bad faith actors are counting on. They want to bypass our critical thinking faculties and appeal directly to our fears, our prejudices, those sorts of deeply held beliefs that aren't always based on reason or evidence.
So, to sum up, I guess what we're saying is that it's important to be skeptical, to question everything, and to be wary of anyone who claims to have all the answers.
Well said. And I would just add one more thing.
Yeah.
Don't underestimate your own intelligence. You don't need to be a military expert or a seasoned diplomat to cut through the noise and make sense of what's going on in the world.
That's a good point.
Use your common sense, do your own research, talk to people who hold different views, and most importantly, Never stop asking questions. Because in a world that's increasingly awash in information, the ability to think critically is not just a useful skill, it's essential.
For a deep dive into some pretty dark and depressing stuff, I gotta say, that's actually a very hopeful note to end on.
Well, I'm an optimist at heart. I have to be.
Well, I appreciate that. And I'm sure our listeners do too. So for
Yeah.
everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this journey into the mind of Colonel Douglas MacGregor. It's been something.
Interesting, to say the least.
Yeah. Interesting is definitely one word for it. All right, everyone. Stay informed, stay engaged, and most importantly, stay critical. We'll see you next time.